Welcome, everyone. Let me just say a couple of things before we start. For the last 4 weeks, we have dealt with specific kind of inoculation problems that the book Saints brings up for us to deal with relative to First Vision and seer stones and the racial issues in the church, and last week, plural marriage. And we've touched upon those. In our last 2 weeks together, I'd like to shift gears just a little bit. And instead of talking not necessarily about issues and problems, but I would like to talk a little bit about 2 of the greatest faith-promoting stories in early church history. Anyway, I would like to talk about 2 of the great moments in the early history of the church, particularly in the life of Joseph, that are, I think, the greatest faith-promoting stories in the early history of the church. Today, I'll just run this through. We're going to talk about this. Something new must be done, the British mission and the emergence of Brigham Young and the 12 to leadership. Now, that doesn't sound very exciting or even really faith-promoting, but it is. And it's one of the greatest stories that we have in early church history. More needs to be done on this, particularly articles and books and things that have been written. One of the things that Saints does is that it brings the British mission into the story. But if you've read ahead and you've been through that part of the book, you'll know that it's so scattered. There's a little bit here, then back to the United States. There's a little bit here, then back to the United States, and a little bit here. And by the time you get to the end, you kind of lose the story in kind of the narrative flow of the book. And I'd like to kind of bring that together for you and then emphasize what I think is the important issue with that, which they hint at but don't clearly bring it out in the book. And so we'll kind of deal with this a little bit today and see what happens. Okay? Here's the question on the table. We have lived through 10, I have, probably you also, 10 changes in administration in our church. From George Albert Smith, who was the president when I was born, 71 years ago, through Russell M. Nelson, 10 changes in leadership where a prophet president has passed and a new prophet president has come to the leadership position of the church. When this happens, as I have asked this question, how prepared is the church today for when this occurs? Is there any confusion? Is there any question who will be the next president? No, I mean, Joseph Fielding Smith said it very clearly in Doctrines of Salvation. When a president of the church dies, the president of the Quorum of the 12 automatically becomes the president of the church. Now, that's our world. Okay? There is no politicking. There's no guesswork. There's no wondering. It is set in stone as to what will happen. And the likelihood that anything would disrupt that is probably zero. Okay? And so we go to General Conference, and they tell us stories. In 1974 and then in 1979, N. Eldon Tanner told this story twice in both of those conferences. It was at the time of the death of Harold B. Lee. And he tells the story of how Harold B. Lee was in the hospital, and it looked like it was going to be his last moments, and the call went out, and the first one to show up at the scene was Marion G. Romney, second counselor in the first presidency. And Eldon Tanner, being the first counselor, was out of town. As he's standing there, President Kimball, president of the Quorum of the 12, walks in the door, and he turns to President Romney and says, "President Romney, is there anything I can do to help you?" And as they're standing there, the doctor comes into the waiting area and announces that, in fact, President Lee has passed. And according to President Tanner, immediately President Romney turned to President Kimball and said, "President Kimball, is there anything I can do to help you?" Okay? Now that story was told 1974, 1979. It's drilled into our minds so that we know what? When the president of the church dies, the president of the Quorum of the 12 automatically becomes the president of the church. Okay? And there is no period where there is no president in the presidency of the church. Okay, so we've been very ingrained with this, been drilled into our minds, and we've been through it 10 times. We don't even have any questions or issues about this. Let me take you through some hypotheticals. Now, I will admit right up front, this will never happen. Just a hypothetical. So we know President Nelson passes. Who becomes the next president of the church? Who? Okay, Dallin H. Oaks. All right, let's suppose, because he's president of the Quorum of the 12, let's suppose that as they leave to go to the Rome Temple dedication next month, they're all on the plane headed across. Now, this would never happen because they never all go on the same plane. Okay, but let's suppose, hypothetically, they're all on the same plane. And somewhere over the Atlantic, there's an engine failure, and the whole plane goes down, and the first presidency and the Quorum of the 12 apostles are all taken at once. Who now becomes the leadership of the church? Okay, any question about that? The first Quorum of 70s with the 7 presidents of 70 at their head reconstitute the church up into the 12 and the presidency, probably by seniority, just as and an ordination date, just as has always been done. So let's suppose that is General Conference, and all of the quorums of the 70s and the first presidency and the Quorum of the 12 have come to Salt Lake City for this meeting. Now, you know, this also will never happen because there are always designated survivors. All right, so, but you know, they all have little offices down in the bottom of the church office building. They're meeting together in their School of the Prophets prior to conference, and there is a terrorist attack on the church office building. Okay, and in one moment, the first presidency, the Quorum of the 12, and the quorums of 70 are all taken away. Who now becomes the leader of the church? No, I didn't hear anything there. Who now becomes the leader of the church? The presiding bishopric or the Relief Society? Does anybody know who becomes the next governing body of the church? Now, normally, you know, when I'm talking about these things, I'm not with a PowerPoint and I have a blackboard and I'm writing on the board as you suggest things. As I've done this, here are the things that have been suggested. The presiding bishop, temple presidents, mission presidents, stake presidents, patriarchs, and as my students sometimes like to say, BYU religion professors. Now that would be scary. Okay. Anybody have anything to add to that list? No? Okay, here's the question. Is the answer on that list? Now, here's my point. Look how far we had to push this to where we're sitting in a situation where we don't know the answer. There is an answer. Okay? My point is going to be that what you're feeling right now is exactly what the church felt when Joseph died. And the question arises here, how well had Joseph prepared the church for his death? On 27th of June, 1844, when Joseph was martyred at Carthage, how well prepared was the church for that moment? You know, Joseph always worried about this. In September of 1840, as his father lay dying in Nauvoo, like Lehi of old, he gathered all of his children together, and one by one he laid his hands upon their head and gave them blessings. In his blessing to Joseph, he said, "Your heart shall meditate great woedom. Your intelligence shall circumscribe and comprehend the deep things of God. Your mouth shall utter the law of the just. Joseph, my son, you shall even live to finish your work." Now, when Joseph heard that, those there said he jumped up off his knees, he clapped his hands, and he cried out, "O Father, shall I?" Because he was always concerned about that. And his father said, "Yes, you shall live to lay out the plan of all the work which God has given you to do. This is my dying blessing upon your head in the name of Jesus, for it shall be fulfilled." Reported by Joseph's mother. Well, that question, notwithstanding, still remains. Was Joseph really prepared for this moment when his death came? Was the church prepared? Had Joseph adequately prepared the saints for this moment? There are two schools of thought on this. And I go to the Mormon History Association meetings, and regularly they have a breakout session on succession in the presidency. And they'll always have 2 or 3 papers presented, and every time there is this strange thing that happens where people try to figure this out. There is one group of scholars that are of this crisis school, okay? And there's one group of scholars that are of a continuity school. The crisis school people say Joseph did not adequately prepare the church, and when he died, there was confusion and there was uncertainty. And they say the reason for that, you can tell, is because there were multiple possible alternatives to where the leadership of the church could have gone. What are some of them? Right? Well, it's too awkward to have a discussion. Let me put some of them out here. One is lineage. In 1839, and again in 1843, Joseph Smith III was given blessings twice that he would, in fact, succeed his father in the presidency of the church. Witnessed to, recorded by the saints. Thomas Bullock, in his handwriting for both of them, has both of those blessings as Joseph laid his hands upon Joseph III's head. Joseph seems to have even later superseded that. You'll remember that when Joseph was martyred, Emma was 5 months pregnant, and she's going to give birth to a young boy named David Hiram Smith. Joseph seemed to know that the new baby would be a boy, in fact named the child, and here's Brigham. Long before his death, Joseph said to me, "I shall have a son born to me, and his name shall be called David. And on him in some future time will rest the responsibility that now rests on me." This is Joseph's declaration to me and others sometime before his death. I can produce plenty of witnesses to the truth of this if necessary. Brigham Young. Or later, "I am looking for the time when the Lord will speak to David Hiram Smith. But let him pursue the course he is now pursuing, and he will never preside over the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in time or in eternity. It would be his right to preside over this church if he would only walk in the true path." So that seems to even supersede the blessing on Joseph III. Well, even so, it's comfortable for us as Latter-day Saints to say, well, looking down the line, this could have happened. But you need to realize this was such a critical issue in the early church that it literally is going to split the church in two, is it not? And we're going to have an LDS church and then our LDS church. And one of the principal differences is going to be questions over the leadership of the church, whether it should go with Brigham or whether it should go with Joseph III, based on these early blessings. So it was a very real possibility even then in 1844. There was also the possibility of the succession by a counselor. Let me read to you. On April 19th, Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, and Zebedee Coltrane laid hands on Brother Sidney Rigdon and confirmed upon him the blessings of wisdom and knowledge to preside over the church in the absence of Brother Joseph. History of the Church, Volume 2, page 251. Now, you know, Sidney, the minute he hears about Joseph's martyrdom, comes right back to Nauvoo, remembering this blessing that he had received, and puts forth his claim.
What year was that?
That blessing was 1834. Okay. Also, we have the possibility of the office of Associate President. This is History of the Church, Volume 3, page 32. President Joseph Smith, Jr. gave a history of the ordination of David Whitmer, which took place in July of 1834, to be a leader or a prophet to this church, which ordination was on condition that he, Joseph, did not live to God himself. So look, now we've got Joseph III, David Hiram, Sidney Rigdon, David Whitmer. Okay, let me just put a couple more up here. The presiding patriarch. This also became very much an issue. This is Brigham Young again. Did Joseph ordain any man to take his place? He did. Who was it? It was Hiram. But Hiram fell a martyr before Joseph did. If Hiram had lived, he would have acted for Joseph. Brigham Young. The 12 apostles. Okay, now, what would be the justification for their claim? Section 107 of the Doctrine and Covenants, correct? Why couldn't Brigham and the 12 just get that out and read it to the saints? Where it says that the quorum of the 12 apostles are equal in power and authority to the presiding first presidency. Why didn't they just get that out and read it? Because the next verse says that the council of the 70s are prophets and seers and equal in power and authority as a quorum to the quorum of the 12 and to the first presidency. And in fact, there were those pushing for the 70s to step into that role. Well, it was even more complicated than that, because in just a couple of verses down from those, it says that the Nauvoo High Council was a quorum equal in power and authority to the 70s, to the quorum of the 12, and to the first presidency of the church. This, in fact, was one that Emma was pushing seriously, because William Marks was the stake president in Nauvoo. He presided over that council. He was an opponent of plural marriage, and she wanted William Marks as the stake president and the standing high council in Nauvoo, because the 12 were the traveling council, not the standing council, to be the guardian of the church until the lineage factor could kick in when Joseph III became of age. Yeah, can you see the problems here? Okay, this is what the crisis school of thought is saying. Look, there was confusion, there was uncertainty, there were multiple alternatives of where the leadership could go. Complicating things were special or secret appointments. Lyman White pulled this one, where he went to Texas and said that he had been set apart and ordained to be the leader and president of the church, and organized an entire community around his leadership in Texas. James Jesse Strang was another one, okay, who went to Beaver Island. I love the title of his biography, The King of Beaver Island, okay, and established his own church. It was very strange. He established himself as prophet. He called a quorum of the 12. He found plates and translated them. He introduced plural marriage and was martyred. Okay? Those complicated things even more. And so the crisis school of thought says, look, Joseph was likely not prepared for the moment when his death came. The church had not been adequately prepared. There was chaos. There was confusion. And the great sign of that is the division of the church at that particular time into its two main branches. Well, I don't know what you think about that, but the continuity school says, no way is that the case. The Lord would never do that to this church in the last dispensation. The church, whose survival is of key critical importance to the coming kingdom of the Lord, Joseph knew. The role of the 12 was firm. The church was adequately prepared. And they will march you through a series of events. On the 21st of February, 1835, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, called together, was given their apostolic charge by Oliver Cowdery, preparing them for the mission that they would have. The 12, on the 10th of August, 1841, Brigham was set apart to supervise the business of the church. On the 16th of August, 1841, there was a general conference from which Joseph was absent and Brigham presides in the conference. On the 3rd and 4th of May, 1842, temple endowments are given to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, okay, as the central group who received them under the hands of Joseph Smith. In November of 1843, Brigham and Mary Ann have their calling and election secured. Joseph goes into semi-retirement at this point, and as the 12 return from their missions, they receive their calling and elections, and they're administered by President Brigham Young. On the 23rd and 26th of March, 1844, there is a dramatic meeting where the Quorum of the 12 meet with the prophet Joseph. He tells them that his time is short. He tells them that they are to receive the blessings and the keys of the kingdom, and gives them the sealing keys, which he says, and I quote, rightly belong to the first presidency of the church. He says to them, now, round up your shoulders and act as men. I roll the burden of the kingdom from my shoulders to yours. Wilford Woodruff, who was there, said, we will never forget the feelings that existed in that room. So, hey, it's very clear that Joseph knew what was going on, that Joseph prepared the church, and that the Quorum of the 12's role was firm and had been adequately prepared for this moment. To which the crisis school says, well, that's fine, but how do you explain all this? How do you explain the lineage issues? How do you explain all of the controversy that went on? How do you explain the division of the church if everything was so smooth in transition? To which the continuity people say, well, you people are nuts because the Lord would never do that. So what's going on here? They even roll out their quotes. Okay? Here's the continuity school, Joseph Smith. I want the blessing once more to lift my voice in the midst of the saints. I would pour out my soul to God for their instruction. It has been the plan of the devil to hamper me and distress me from the beginning to keep me from explaining myself to them, and I never have had opportunity to give them the plan that God has revealed to me. Brigham Young. If Joseph Smith Jr., the prophet, had followed the spirit of revelation in him, he never would have gone to Carthage. And never for one moment did he say that he had one particle of light in him after he started back from Montrose to give himself up in Nauvoo. This he did through the persuasion of others, Emma principally. I want you all to understand that if Joseph had followed the revelations in him, he would have followed the shepherd instead of the shepherd following the sheep. Brigham Young. Here's an interesting quote from Isaac Scott. You will likely hear a great deal about Joseph's innocence, such as, I go as a lamb to the slaughter, and if I die an innocent man. All these statements, I believe, are false and got up for the purpose of reconciling the minds of the church. I believe they had not the least idea that they were going to be murdered. Hiram said the last time I heard him preach, which was only a few days before he and Joseph were taken to Carthage, that their enemies could not kill brother Joseph, for he had a great work to accomplish yet. There was also considerable sin in Carthage, which proves beyond dispute that they did not expect death. Now, this is why history is fun, because the continuity school also have their quotes. They trot them out. Joseph, I know what I say. I understand my mission in business. God Almighty is my shield, and what can man do if God is my friend? I shall not be sacrificed until my time comes, then I shall be offered freely. Joseph Fielding, we'll talk about him in a moment. All had been done. Joseph and Hiram had done all that they could have done, and the foundation of the great work of the last days was laid, so that it could be finished by the 12 apostles who had been instructed in all things pertaining to the kingdom of God on this earth. John Fulmer. Joseph Smith had succeeded in completely organizing the church, conferring keys, authority, and endowments upon the apostles and others, so that the work can go on as well as when he alone was propelling it, and better, because there are more now to push it, each holding all the power which he held in the priestly office. So, here's my question. Who's right here? Who's correct? Is it the crisis school or is it the continuity school? Now, I know, because we're all faithful Latter-day Saints, we want it to be what? Okay, but how do you explain the other issues if, in fact, the transition was so smooth? So I would even ask you, by the show of hands, how many are in the crisis camp? Oh, you faithful souls. Okay? So how would then, if you are all in the continuity school, how do you explain the crisis? How do you explain the lineage issues, all these ordinations that were given, the division of the church? How do you explain that? I think there is an answer to this. And I don't understand why my colleagues can't get it. Okay? And the answer to this, which one of these is right? Both of them are. Both of these things are right. But you have to understand what the reality of the church was in Nauvoo. Okay? There wasn't one church in Nauvoo under Joseph's life. There were two churches. There was a public church, and there was a private church. The public church did the business of the church, the day-to-day things that needed to be taken care of, the worship services. That was the public church, the go-to-Sunday meeting church in Nauvoo. The private church was headlined by the Relief Society and the Masonic Lodge, both organized within 2 days of each other in the upper floor of the red brick store, Joseph's red brick store in Nauvoo. It was in these two groups that Joseph gave his most important discussions. I wished we had time to spend 2 hours and talk about the organization of the Relief Society and Joseph's discourses to the Relief Society from its organization through 1843. Because it is these two groups that were prepared for the temple, that were prepared for the ordinances, that were prepared for prayer circles that met secretly in the evenings all around Nauvoo during Joseph Smith's lifetime of the Anointed Quorum. These were things that the public church really knew nothing. Public church really knew nothing about. In fact, you're going to have Brigham Young say of William Marks, who is the stake president in Nauvoo, I have known that Brother Marks had no evidence but the written word. But if this people have no evidence but the written word, it is quite time to go to the river and be baptized for remission of their sins. Brother Marks don't know all the ordinations. I think he probably meant ordinances there. Nor will he until he knows something more than the written word. Now, that clearly shows what the issues are here. And what was causing this? I told you last week, every question, every problem that you have in Nauvoo, you answer with two words. Plural marriage. Who was invited to become part of the Relief Society? Only those sisters who had been introduced to the principle of plural marriage. Who had been invited to become members of the Masonic Lodge? Only those brothers who had been introduced into the practice of plural marriage. And it is in those two groups that met quietly and privately that Joseph introduced the things of the temple, that Joseph introduced the ordinances of the temple, the endowment, and the fullness of the priesthood ordinances. And it is among that group that met in prayer circles after their endowments all over Nauvoo in the evenings. Now, why did this happen? Well, I can give you a brief summary. After Joseph left Missouri, I think he probably was glad and thought he had left plural marriage behind. But in 1840, he has an experience recorded by Eliza R. Snow, where an angel with a drawn sword appears to him and tells him he must move forward in the practice of plural marriage, or his priesthood would be taken away and he would be destroyed. So, on the 6th of August, 1841, in a conference of the church, Joseph stands up and publicly announces the practice of plural marriage. He saw what had happened in Kirtland when they tried to keep it secret. Got himself tarred and feathered for it. And so he comes out publicly in the morning session of conference. As the conference breaks for the noon session, there is a rush to the Mansion House. "Oh, Mr. Smith, you have done it now." This is a quote. You have spoken blasphemy. You have ruined us as a people. You must take back what you have said." And so Joseph goes back in the afternoon session of the conference and unpreaches the principle of plural marriage. Does that, however, release him from his mandate? And so he's forced underground again in Nauvoo. And quietly, privately, he begins to introduce this practice. And this is the rise of the private church in Nauvoo. For the public church, what happened was a crisis. For the private church, it was continuity. Now, I know you can't read these, okay, from where you are, but what's important here is just the circles. Okay, these are Venn diagrams, and where the diagrams intersect is where they have things in common. So this circle out here are the general authorities. This circle here is the authorities who have received, those who have received their endowments. These are the ones who have received the fullness of the priesthood ordinances, the higher ordinances of the priesthood. And the only group who had everything is the Quorum of the 12. Okay. This one, we add another one, general authorities, okay, those who received their endowments, those who received the higher ordinances of the priesthood, and those called to the Council of 50, which was Joseph's last organizational move of the spiritual rule and the political rule. And again, the only people who were members of everything were the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. So we can see that. We can see what was happening, but boots on the ground in 1844 was a very, very difficult time for many people in Nauvoo as they struggled with things over these issues of the public and the private and what had been going on in Nauvoo. Does that make any sense? All right. So my question is, and this is just a setup for what we want to talk about. Here is this situation in Nauvoo where there is a lot of uncertainty. Some know, some don't. How are we going to handle this? And what's going to happen? And I think this is one of the greatest faith-promoting stories in the history of this church, that we've suggested some parts of it here for just a minute, but I would like to take you back now and look at the whole thing of what's happening. We need to back up for a long ways, clear back to the 1st of June, 1837. All right, so we're 7 years away from the martyrdom. And it seems to me that the Lord has set in motion all of those things that will guarantee, notwithstanding what confusion may or may not have been in Nauvoo, will guarantee the continuation of his church and the succession in the leadership in the proper manner. So 1837 was a difficult time for Joseph. Apostasy was brewing all over Kirtland. In the Panic of 1837, which was at least as terrible as the Depression of the 1930s, banks all over the United States began to fail. Joseph had created a so-called bank in Nauvoo. They had tried to charter it, but their charter had been turned down, so they kind of created an unbank, which they called the Kirtland Safety Society. The Safety Society was a great idea. They had ample assets to build upon. However, all of their assets were land speculation. And when the bottom fell out of the land market, the society failed. And when it failed, whose fault was it? Joseph's. Well, things are terrible. It's so bad that Joseph receives an unpublished revelation on the 12th of January, 1838, of how to remove a sitting president from the church. It's, like I said, unpublished revelation, but it's in the archives. That's how threatened he was feeling. Where one day, on the 1st of June, 1837, Joseph seeks out Heber C. Kimball, who was sitting in the pulpits on the first floor of the Kirtland Temple. And Joseph comes to Heber and says, "Brother Heber, the Lord has revealed to me that something new must be done for the salvation of the church." Now, given the context of 1837, we're going to want to think that all of the apostasy problems, all of the issues that are going on, Joseph receiving this unpublished revelation of how to remove a sitting president, that these things are becoming so bad with even the witnesses of the Book of Mormon leaving him, that this something new is going to be dealing with these kind of ambient things that are going on in Kirtland, Ohio in 1837. But I don't think so. I think we need to be much further looking down the road than that. This revelation, Joseph said to Heber, "Brother Heber, the Spirit of the Lord has whispered to me, let my servant Heber go to England and proclaim my gospel and open the door of salvation to that nation." Well, the story is even more intriguing than this, because we need to back off another 6 years. So now we're back in 1831, where in Kirtland, Ohio, Joseph, who was very busy with the Joseph Smith translation and everything that he was doing, didn't have time to call upon the brethren to serve in the mission field. So he appointed Heber C. Kimball to call the brethren on their missions. And so Heber would go around, try to receive revelation who should be called. And if you're sitting in your house one day and you open a door and there's Heber, you're in trouble. Okay? Well, recently arrived in Kirtland, Ohio was Parley B. Pratt. with his wife, very ill, Mary Ann. They rented a ramshackle house. Mary Ann was lying on the bed. She had actually been in the bed in the back of the wagon as they rolled into Kirtland. She laid in the bed and the back ceiling dipped down so far it almost touched her. Parley was stricken with malaria, and he was out in the front part of the house on a dirt floor lying on a mat. Guess who? Heber C. Kimball. He walked in, Parley, you're going on a mission. And Parley's response was, oh, how can I? Can't you just wait for a season till I recover from my illness, till Mary Ann feels better? I don't have a home. Let us get established here, and then we'll leave. Read Parley's autobiography. Heber walks over, kneels down, puts his hands on Parley's head, and says, thou shalt go to Upper Canada, even to the city of Toronto, the capital, and there thou shalt find a people prepared for the fullness of the gospel, and they shall receive thee, and thou shalt organize the church among them, and it shall spread thence into regions round about. And many shall be brought to the knowledge of the truth, and shall be filled with joy, and from these things, growing out of this mission, shall the fullness of the gospel spread into England, and cause a great work to be done in that land. 6 years later, then, Heber himself is called to England. Now, look how far back this goes as the dominoes start to fall and the wheels are set in motion. Well, there were some other parts of this blessing that were quite amazing. He restores Parley to his health. He tells Parley that Mary Ann is going to have a child. It will be a little boy, and he shall name it after himself. Now, this was quite a blessing, because Parley and Mary Ann have been married for 10 years, and they're childless. 6 of those years, Mary Ann has been consumptive. She's not going to live very much longer, and will die and is buried there in Kirtland. So it was quite an amazing blessing. Parley, faithful as he is, rises up, and you need to read his autobiography because his story is amazing. He makes his way towards Toronto. As he comes to the border, he has to cross Lake Ontario. Okay, anybody seen Lake Ontario? How big is that? It's like standing on the ocean. There's 2 ways to go. You can walk all the way around it, or you can take the ferry. Parley's still somewhat weakened, thinks he cannot walk. He doesn't have money for the ferry, so he goes to the woods and he kneels down and he says, Heavenly Father, you called me on this mission. I didn't want to come, but I came. Now I got to get over across this lake, and I'm not walking. Seriously, you should read the prayer. Yeah, I need some money. $2 will be great. I'll just go out there and wait. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. And so he walks out, and he no sooner he gets out of the woods, and someone says, hey, excuse me, who are you? Well, I'm Parley P. Pratt. Well, what do you do? I'm a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ. Well, you look like you could use some money. Will $2 be enough? The ferry whistle blows. Thank you. Okay, he goes to lake. No, wait a sec. Going to Toronto? Hey, I know some people in Toronto. Maybe you should get to know them. And so he takes out a piece of paper and writes the name. The ferry whistle's blowing. He grabs it, folds it, puts it in his pocket, just takes off. Jumps from the wharf to the ferry as it's pulling out. Makes his way to Toronto. He gets to Toronto, can't find a place to live, can't find a place to eat. Okay, he is literally traveling without purse and scrip and in trouble when he remembers the folded paper in his pocket. And he pulls it out and opens it up, and whose name is on it? John Taylor. Well, to make a long story short, okay, the conversions in Toronto are amazing, but it's not President Taylor we're interested in, because in that congregation that he has so much success with is a man whose wife has passed away by the name of Joseph Fielding. He has 2 daughters, Mercy and Mary Fielding, who will become Mary Fielding Smith, whose oldest son will be Joseph F. Smith, whose oldest son will be Joseph Fielding Smith, whose daughter marries Bruce R. McConkie. That's how these things work. Right? Well, Joseph Fielding has a brother, guess where? England. Reverend James Fielding, who's the minister in Vauxhall Chapel. Well, why this mission to England? And we'll come back to that in just a second. I thought you might appreciate this quote. From the records of the accomplishments of the apostolic mission to Britain, there is only one conclusion to be drawn. Britain is the mother lode of Ephraim, the point from which the majority of the tribe have become scattered in the world and have since been gathered into the fold of Zion. Continuing the quote, Britain's isolation from the mainland provided the ideal location for Israel to become concentrated and immune to the Gentile influences that constantly harassed the mainland from Asia and the Mediterranean. No Hun invaders, disrupted her life, or polluted her blood. No Muslim yoke strangled her religion. No Slavonic pressure was exerted upon her, so that Britain emerged from the medieval period the most undefiled nation in Europe, according to the blood of Ephraim, with the possible exception of Norway and Sweden. Okay? You wonder why the missionaries are called there, but there's probably something more from last week. Here is the Royal Coat of Arms of Great Britain. Okay? There are two figures on this coat of arms, the lion and the unicorn. What are these? From the patriarchal blessings of the 12 tribes. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion, and as an old lion, who shall rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet. When they're restated in Deuteronomy, here's the blessing to Joseph. Let the blessings come upon the head of Joseph. His glory are like the firstlings of a bullock, and his horns are like the horns of unicorns. With them he shall push the people to the ends of the earth. He shall push the people together to the ends of the earth, and they are the 10,000s of Ephraim. Well, you remember from our discussion last week that the leadership blood of the church must combine what? The blood of Judah, the blood of Joseph. Why are we sent to Great Britain? Well, it's not surprising that all of the original members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles are descended from one common ancestor from Great Britain, John Lathrop. Okay? How the blood of Judah gets into England is another story that we, could spend another 2 or 3 weeks talking about, but seems to be his mother's lineage. And in case you were just interested, this is Severn End, Hanley Castle, which is the ancestral home of Lucy Mack Smith. Okay? There are some amazing things here as to why it would have gone there. However, the call to go now becomes even more fascinating. This is kind of lengthy. Heber's called on this mission. Now, I'll tell you. This is Orson F. Whitney's Life of Heber C. Kimball. Next to the Scriptures, the most spiritual book in the church. No question. It's gift worthy. I've given it to every single one of my children. It is so amazing. One of my prized possessions is this first edition of Heber C. Kimball's or Orson F. Whitney's book. This to me is priceless. Is Lynette here? Did I ever tell you how much this cost? $29.99. A little bit more than that. Anyway, there are some changes that took place from this edition to the newer edition, which we'll talk about in just a second. But it is truly a marvel. As Heber receives this mission call, here's what he says. The thought was overpowering. He, Heber, had been surprised at his call to the apostleship. Now he was overwhelmed. Like Jeremiah, he staggered under the weight of his own weakness, exclaiming in self-humiliation, "O Lord, I am a man of stammering tongue, altogether unfit for such a work. How can I go to preach in that land which is so famed throughout Christendom for learning, knowledge, and piety, the nursery of religion, and to a people whose intelligence is proverbial?" You remember that Heber C. Kimball is a simple man, a potter by trade. A man who in the school of the prophets couldn't even do vowels. And Joseph had to say to him, "Heber, you do those vowels or I'll whip you." And Heber replied, "Whip away." You can see why he would feel this way. Feeling my weakness to go on such an errand, I asked the prophet if Brother Brigham might go with me. He replied that he wanted Brother Brigham to stay with him, for he had something else for him to do. The idea of such a mission was almost more than I could bear up under. I was almost ready to sink under the burden which was placed upon me. And then this. However, all these considerations did not deter me from my path of duty. The moment I understood the will of my Heavenly Father, I felt a determination to go at all hazards, believing that He would support me by His almighty power and endow me with every qualification that I needed. And although my family was dear to me and I should have to leave them almost destitute, I felt that the cause of truth, the gospel of Christ, outweighed every other consideration. There you go. This book is just full of this stuff. One of the interesting things, he says, the presidency laid their hands on me and set me apart to preside over the mission and conferred great blessings upon my head, said that God would make me mighty in that nation in winning souls unto Him. Angels should accompany me and bear me up, that my feet should never slip, that I should be mightily blessed and prove a source of salvation to thousands, not only in England, but America, from this mission. Now, what does that mean? Well, I don't want to burden you with too much of this, but as he prepares for this mission, something happens. He's struck down. After being called on this mission, I went daily into the east room in the attic story of the temple, poured out my soul unto the Lord, asking His protection and power to fill honorably the mission appointed me by His servants. A short time previous to starting, I was laid prostrate on my bed. Not prostate. Prostrate on my bed. I could not stir a limb. Joseph, hearing of it, came to see me, bringing Oliver Cowdery and Bishop Partridge with him. They prayed for and blessed me, Joseph being mouth, beseeching God to raise me up. He then took me by the right hand and said, "Brother Heber, I take you by your right hand in the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth and by virtue of the holy priesthood vested in me. I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to arise. Be thou made whole." I arose from my bed, put on my clothes, and started with them and went up to the temple. Now, Heber being struck down as he's getting ready to leave, it's significant, as we're going to see in just a minute. He has a very young family, okay? Young children, young wife. He must leave them behind on their own. Fortunately, Robert B. Thompson, who is going to go a portion of the journey with him, comes to Heber's home on the morning that he's going to leave and has left us this memory. The day appointed for the departure of the elders to England having arrived, I stepped into the house of Brother Kimball to ascertain when he would start, as I expected to accompany him 200 or 300 miles, intending to spend my labors in Canada that season. The door being partly open, I entered and felt struck with the sight which presented itself to my view. I would have retired, thinking that I was intruding, but I felt riveted to the spot. The Father was pouring out His soul to that God who rules on high, who all the earth surveys, that rides upon the stormy sky and calms the roaring seas, that He would grant him a prosperous voyage across the mighty ocean and make him useful wherever his lot should be cast, and that he who careth for sparrows and feedeth the young ravens when they cry would supply the wants of his wife and little ones in his absence. He then, like the patriarchs and by virtue of his office, laid his hands upon their heads, and individually leaving a father's blessing upon them and commending them to the care and protection of God while he should be engaged preaching the gospel in a foreign land. While thus engaged, his voice almost lost in the sobs of those around him who tried in vain to suppress them. The idea of being separated from their protector and father for so long a time was indeed painful. He proceeded, but his heart was too much affected to do so regularly. His emotions were great. He was obliged to stop at intervals while big tears rolled down his cheeks and index to the feelings which reigned in his bosom. My heart was not stout enough to refrain. In spite of myself, I wept and mingled my tears with theirs. At the same time, I felt thankful that I had the privilege of contemplating such a scene. I realized that nothing could induce that man to tear himself from so affectionate a family group, from his partner and children who were dear to him, nothing but a sense of duty and a love to God and an attachment to his cause. Now, if you want to know what faith is, brothers and sisters, you need to look no further than Heber C. Kimball. Interesting. When they arrive in England, their first appointments are in Vauxhall Chapel. This is a picture of Vauxhall in 1960. You can see it's tearing down, it's coming apart. It was actually eventually torn down. President Hinckley served his mission here. When he heard it was being torn down, he traveled all the way to Preston and got a brick from that building and had it on his desk all of his days. That's how important it was to him. Today, it's a kind of a medical building, so not very interesting to see, but at least you can see the location modernly where it's sat. The minister of this congregation is James Fielding, Joseph Fielding's brother. Joseph Fielding is called with Heber C. Kimball to accompany him on this mission. The spiritual experiences don't end here. Listen to this. The Fieldings of Canada wrote to their reverend brother in Preston an account of the rise and progress of the latter-day work, and thus prepared him for the advent of the elders upon the British shores. He in turn told his congregation and exhorted them to pray to the Lord to send his servants unto them. Now this is the minister of this Anglican congregation. And obedient to his counsel, the worthiest and most pious members of his flock commenced praying for the coming of the elders from America. Their faith shook the heavens, and in dreams and visions many were shown the very men whom the Lord was about to send into their midst. Heber C. Kimball, especially on his arrival in Preston, was recognized by persons who had never until then beheld him in the flesh. If you've never read this, you need to. Interesting comment. Their first meeting, and I know I'm reading a lot, but it's really wonderful and important. The day after their arrival in Preston, being the Sabbath, the brethren, on invitation of Mr. Fielding, repaired to Vauxhall Chapel, where he held forth from his own pulpit. The first speaker was Heber C. Kimball. Says he, I declared that an angel had visited the earth and committed the everlasting gospel to man, called their attention to the first principles of the gospel. Another appointment was given out for the brethren in the evening when Elder Goodson preached and Joseph Fielding bore testimony, and still another for Wednesday night when Apostle Hyde held forth and Elder Richards added his testimony. The chapel was filled to overflowing, and many were pricked in their hearts, being convinced of the truth, and began to praise God and rejoice exceedingly. Thus it was, to use Reverend Fielding's famous phrase, that Kimball bored the holes, Goodson drove the nails, and Hyde clinched them. Okay, wonderful. Well, they are all living in a house on Wilford Street in Preston. Their rooms are these upper two rooms on the highest story. Before Heber left, that he was struck down here it happens again, and you all know this story. On an evening, these four missionaries that are there, Goodson, Fielding, Hyde, and Kimball, are assaulted and struck by the forces of evil in an attempt to destroy them. Heber is knocked senselessly to the floor. The demons rush them, foaming at their mouths, gnashing their teeth, threatening their destruction. They look upon this vision for an hour and a half, when finally it withdraws and they are left to their own. You get the sense that something unusual is to take place in Great Britain. Well, what's the result of this? Just a couple of quick things. This is Avonham Park in Preston. The days of the first baptisms of Reverend Fielding's congregation came. A large congregation gathered on the green here in Avonham Park. They were so excited, nobody could decide who would have the privilege of being the first baptized, so they ran a foot race. Okay, and George D. Watt, Nathan Morgan's great-great-grandfather, won the race and claimed first place for himself and second place for his mother. They then retired across the green over to the bridge, okay, and to the baptismal site in Avonham Park, where those good brothers and sisters of Reverend Fielding's congregation were baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There's a beautiful monument there that's right here in Avonham Park. That's a monument to these first baptisms and this missionary labor, with a beautiful plaque explaining what took place here and why it was significant for this location. So if you ever have a chance to go there, make sure you don't miss that. Well, to make a long story short, I'm going to try to encapsulate all of the British mission in one story. This is Al Round's painting of Chatburn Downham Village. I understand that it hangs in the MTC because of the meaning of this picture. Heber C. Kimball had been inspired by revelation that he should go to Chatburn Village and there preach the gospel. When he made this announcement, he was warned off by all of the people who lived there in the area where he was working. This village was notorious for not accepting any preacher of any gospel, any minister of any faith, driving them out, running them out on a rail, stoning them, where they said, whatever you do, don't go there. To which Heber replied, I cannot reject the spirit of inspiration that I have. Couldn't find anybody to go with him, so he went by himself. Okay? He walked into the city. He arranged a preaching place in an old barn, and he stood up on a barrel, and he began to preach, looking over his shoulders at any moment for the stones to fly. As he was preaching, he felt a tug on his coat, and he looked down, and there was a young boy. Mister, he said, please, when can I be baptized? The first day in Chatburn Village, he baptized 25. He came back the next morning and baptized 30 more. He came back in the evening and baptized another 20. Okay? It was truly amazing. One of the amazing occurrences in all of Heber C. Kimball's ministry is that as he gets towards the end of his mission, he's kind of coming back to do a mission tour of all the places he had worked and visit the places and the cities he had labored in. He goes back to Chatburn. He gets a mile from the village, and the children of the village are waiting for him. He didn't know they were coming. They had no way to know he was going to be there. As they saw him, they run to him. They take his hand. They skip by him. He's like the Pied Piper. As he approaches the village, the streets are lined on both sides with the people of the village. And when they see him with the children, they break out in the hymns of Zion. 3 times he has to excuse himself and go to the river Ribble and wash the tears out of his eyes. Well, you know, Lynette and I spent a wonderful afternoon in Chatburn Village. one afternoon. It was truly amazing to stand there and know these stories and feel the spirit of place that's there. There are two quotations, I think, of great importance. First of all, in explaining this event, his biographer said this: "It was a rare scene indeed, and a suggestive one for the parallel of which the mind must leap backward nigh 2,000 years. On the next day, much people that were come to the feast, when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, took branches of palm trees and went forth to meet him and cried, Hosanna, blessed is the King of Israel that cometh in the name of the Lord. So it was with this servant of Christ, this brother of Jesus in the British Isles. The hireling priests, the Pharisees of Christendom, prevailed nothing. The world went after him, whole villages at a sweep, singing praises, shouting in the tones of rapture, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord." There was divine harmony in this. In Heber, his character, manner, and methods, we say it reverently, there was much of the Christ. The might of the lion, the meekness of the lamb, his also was the Savior's lineage. His heart a kindred spirit, in his veins the selfsame blood, which causes are similar, where causes are similar, should there not spring similar results. That's quite an astounding statement. As Heber returns from his mission, he goes to Joseph Smith and he says, "Why did this happen? How can I explain this? Why me?" And Joseph says to him, "Heber, it wasn't you." The prophet Joseph told him in after years that the reason he felt as he did in the streets of Chatburn was because the place was indeed holy ground, that some of the ancient apostles had traveled in that region and dedicated the land, and that he, Heber, had reaped the benefit of their blessing. Wow. Now, you can kind of see here what's happening in England. Thousands and thousands are gathered into the fold by these missionaries. And now we go back to our first story. Watch what happens. Something new must be done for the salvation of the church. That in itself initiated 6 years before with the calling of Parley P. Pratt to Canada and the conversion of Joseph Fielding to the church. From January 1837 from June 1837 until January 1840, the missions in England began to grow and prosper. People joined the church in astounding numbers. And then all of a sudden, something happened among the membership of the church in England. Suddenly, they are compelled, starting in January of 1844, to leave their land, no matter what the cost, and travel to Nauvoo, Illinois, and join the church and gather with the church there. When they start to do this, the missionaries try to hold them back. Don't do that. Our job is to build up the kingdom, build up the church in the British Isles. Listen, here's William Clayton. As early as 1840, William Clayton wrote to Willard Richards that the saints were, quote, making ready for America without counsel, and in their present state of religion only feel to say they should go. Here's Brigham Young. The saints have got to start to gather to America, and go they will, and nothing can stop them. They have so much of the spirit of the gathering that they would go if they knew they would die as soon as they got there, or if they knew that the mob would be upon them and drive them as soon as they got there. John Taylor. No sooner were the people baptized than they are seized with a desire to gather with the main body of the church. I find it difficult to keep anything from the saints, for the Spirit of God reveals it to them. All are anxious to leave their homes, their kindred associations of a lifetime, to join the main body of the church in a distant land, the members of which were total strangers to them. They can't hold them back. They just start to flow. A year goes by. Okay? It is now February 1841. And all of a sudden, the missionaries start to get it. Okay? They don't lead the way, they're the followers here. And all of a sudden, the missionaries start to get these things. You read in their journals some interesting stuff. Heber C. Kimball, I expect trouble is coming there. I feel as though I want to be there and share with them, the saints, if they suffer. Wilford Woodruff, the next month in March, my mind is deeply impressed with the necessity of urging the gathering of the saints. This at the present time seems to be the most important and almost the only subject that I feel to converse about while among the churches. So now the apostles are on board. And what happens? There is a literal flood of immigrants coming to the church in Nauvoo. The church in Great Britain is literally drained of these good, faithful Latter-day Saints. Here's some statistics. Branch records for one large branch in Manchester indicate that almost all converts in the entire branch set out for Nauvoo within 2 years after their baptism. At least 33 groups of converts from the British missions chartered passage to New Orleans and then up the Mississippi River to Nauvoo during the 5-year period, 1841 to 1846. Most of those ships carried in excess of 200 passengers. I find this fascinating. In 1838, 1839, as the saints leave Missouri and come to Illinois, 6,000 saints come to Nauvoo and the surrounding areas. In the 1840 United States Census, Nauvoo showed 800 houses in which live 4,800 people. Okay? In 1842, interestingly enough, in a survey and a census the church ran, there were still 800 households, but the population had dropped to 4,000. I'm assuming older children married, moving out, brethren leaving and going out in the neighboring communities to work, spreading out among the other areas around Nauvoo. Many left because of apostasy and the difficultness of the life. But by 1842, there were 4,000 people living in Nauvoo. The 1845 census, 3 years later, shows 11,000 people living in the city limits, and likely 15,000 people overall if we count Ramus and Montrose and all of those surrounding areas, Quincy, where the Latter-day Saints were. Where did those people come from? Great Britain, that British mission. First, inspired the people, that they felt it in their hearts, and off they come. Then the missionaries get on board, and then for those periods of time, look at that flow of people from Great Britain into the Nauvoo area. And as they come, many of them don't even know who Joseph Smith is. Many of them arrive after Joseph has been martyred. Their loyalty, their allegiance, only to who? Our missionaries. Something new must be done for the salvation of the church. I love this picture. Okay, here's a group of these folks with Brigham at as their mission president on their missions in England. Our missionaries. Now, you know how converts feel about the missionaries who have brought them into the church. Okay? A population swelling from 4,000 to 11,000 right at the critical moment, whose only allegiance is to Brigham Young and the quorum of the 12 apostles. What do you make of this? Now, I look back from the calling of the British mission in 1837, well, from the the migration of these saints into Nauvoo, to the arrival of the missionaries on the shore, and the miraculous callings that they received, to the calling of Heber C. Kimball to be one of those missionaries, to his calling to Parley P. Pratt, we walk back from 1844 to 1831 to see what the Lord has set in motion. And here, brothers and sisters, I feel is one of the greatest stories in church history that sometimes we don't think about very much. Well, we know what happened. Okay, when Brigham Young arrives in Nauvoo, two distinctive meetings are held on the 7th and 8th of August, 1844, in the grove, the East Grove, that was around the temple that they used for their meetings. Now, in some of the accounts, it's a little bit difficult because some of them say that Sidney spoke and Brigham spoke and Sidney spoke, but what it appears is that Sidney spoke on the 7th of August meeting, and then Brigham spoke on the 8th and invited Sidney to speak again, and he declined. But in some of the accounts, you'll hear them saying, they kind of run it together a little bit. But I want you to listen to what happened because you know. Okay? Brigham stands up, Sidney Rigdon makes his claim, Brigham stands up, makes his claim, and you've got 15,000 people who look at Sidney Rigdon and say, what? Who the heck are you? And then Brigham stands up, and 15,000 people say what? Ah, our missionaries. Sidney never had a chance. But there were some people in Nauvoo that were the old-timers who may or may not have been confused. And as was mentioned before, how was this solved? Well, we have that great moment that we call the transfiguration of Brigham Young. The British saints don't need this, but the old-time Nauvoo people do. I put just 3 quotes in here. I put this one in because this is Lynette's great-great-grandfather who was there in that meeting. The 12 apostles were all away from home. Before they got back, Sidney Rigdon wanted to call a meeting and have the people choose him for their leader. The people said no. Wait until the 12 comes home. Brigham Young was the first to arrive. After they all come, there was a meeting called to choose a leader. It was held in a grove where they held meetings in the summertime. I was there. Rigdon spoke first. It did not have the right ring. When he sat down, Brother Brigham got up. The mantle of Joseph fell upon him. He was the picture of Joseph, and he had the prophet's voice. It was a great surprise for the people. The saints was shown who was to be their leader. Now, did you notice Brigham changing to Joseph in that picture? I want you to see if you're paying attention. Okay. This is Louis Barney. The next day, Brigham Young arrived in Nauvoo with some of the other apostles from a mission to the eastern states and called a meeting and invited Sidney Rigdon to the stand. And in the presence of the assembled thousands of saints said to Sidney, now if you have anything to say, you have the opportunity and you can take the stand. But Sidney declined and kept his seat. President Young then arose and took the stand, his face and countenance having the appearance of Joseph. His voice and words were the familiar voice and words of our martyred prophet, so much so the whole congregation was fully satisfied that the mantle of the prophet had fallen on him, and some of the saints really believed it was in reality the prophet himself. Well do I remember the feelings that possessed my breast at that time. I knew it was Brigham Young, and being familiar with the countenance, voice, and manner of the speech of the prophet Joseph Smith, I also knew the mantle of the prophet had fallen on Brigham, and it was marvelous and a miracle wrought by the power of God in the sight and hearing of the whole multitude, that they might never doubt that Brigham was their chosen leader of the church. So you can see by these two things that are occurring here, okay, things become very settled rather quickly. Let's bring the sisters in on this. This is Emmeline. I wanted particularly to tell you the manifestation when the mantle of the prophet fell upon Brigham Young. I was standing in a wagon box on wheels, so I did not have to rise. But those who were seated arose and made that exclamation. I could see very well, and every one of them thought it was really the prophet Joseph risen from the dead. But after Brigham had spoken a few words, the tumult subsided, and the people really knew that it was not the prophet Joseph, but the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. It was the most wonderful manifestation, I think, that I have ever known or seen. And I've seen a great number. After that, we had the greatest faith in him, the greatest that could possibly be. Emmeline B. Wells. Well, I think I can see, and I hope you can, what's happening here and how the Lord prepared the church for this moment. And even though there was going to be some confusion and uncertainty because of the private and public issues in Nauvoo, all had been set in motion as early as 1831, that when this moment came, there was a majority of the people, a vast majority of the people, only loyal to Brigham and the 12 Apostles, and for the few who were still uncertain, the transfiguration of Brigham Young that brought things to a conclusion. Now, one of the great stories, but the story continues. And if I may be personal for just a minute, let me tell you a story. Lynette and I had the opportunity of spending some time in Falkirk, Scotland. The chapel, or the church in Falkirk, was built in 969 AD and still standing. Okay, it's a wonderful place for me, and we went specifically there because in Falkirk, on the 22nd of July, 1298, we have what's called the Battle of Falkirk. Now, you know, if you had seen Braveheart, which I know you haven't because it was rated R, okay, this is the battle where William Wallace lost, okay, and was captured by the British. In that battle, there was a horrible slaughter, and in the church in Falkirk are the only two known graves of those who died in the Battle of Falkirk on the 22nd of July, 1298. One of them is Sir John Bonkill, my 21st great-grandfather. Okay, Sir John Stewart of Bonkill. One of the only two known graves there. From where I took this picture, if I turn around 180 degrees, 90 degrees, and just took the picture the other way, the other grave is over there. This is Lynette's 20th great-grandfather. Okay, those graves, I mean, literally next door to each other. And we always knew back into this period of time, this is Sir John Stewart of Bonkill, this is Sir George Graham. And the Grahams and the Gillespies and the Stewarts had all intermarried, and we knew we were related clear back to here. But, you know, that's why our children have so many problems, I'm sure. But it's an amazing story. Sir John Stewart of Bonkill had married the daughter of Robert the Bruce, okay, who is my 22nd great-grandfather by direct descent. This is our home in Stirling Castle, in Stirling, Scotland. Standing by Robert the Bruce, looking off into the distance, you can see the William Wallace Monument out there. It's a wonderful part of story of my life and our heritage as I come to know this. But that's not the important part. The Stewarts grew up in the Glasgow area. We're Midland Scots. And into that area came the four missionaries: Alexander Wright, Hiram Clark, Reuben Hedlock, and George D. Watt, the winner of the race at Avenham Park. Okay, now Orson Pratt and Samuel Molnar, they stayed over here in Edinburgh, where they were having absolutely no success whatsoever. In fact, they were having so little success that Orson Pratt makes the decision to not preach anymore, but to publish. And all of those great tracts that come out of Great Britain, the first edition of the Pearl of Great Price, all of those, they all come from this moment. These 4 missionaries move over into this area and they begin to labor. Stirling, Falkirk, Glasgow, all of this area where my family is basically from. It was interesting to me that the very first baptisms in Scotland were in Paisley, Scotland, just outside of Glasgow. Now that's interesting to me because Paisley is the place of the Renfrewshire Abbey there in Paisley. And Renfrewshire Abbey is the burial place of the High Stewards of Scotland. Walter, Alan the Stewart, Walter the Stewart, Alexander Stewart, James Stewart, Walter Stewart. These are all my direct ancestors buried there. And here's where the first baptism in Scotland took place. Now, I don't know what the correlation with that is. Robert the Bruce's first wife, Marjorie, also lies here, who died in childbirth, giving birth to their first son. Okay? It's a really quite an amazing place. Well, in this area, Agnes Gillespie and her parents, Peter and Martha, joined the church under the administration of those 4 missionaries. They, like many, traveled to Preston, where in the Royal Albert Docks, they embarked on their ships for America and for the United States. We had the wonderful opportunity, we're there, these docks now that were the Royal Albert Docks where the passengers stayed awaiting for their ships to accept them, is now a Holiday Inn. And so Lynette and I stayed there in the Holiday Inn in the Royal Docks, right where Agnes and her family, the Gillespies, had joined the church and stayed as they awaited their boat. They chartered the James Pennell, which left Liverpool on the 2nd of September 1849 and arrived in New Orleans on the 22nd of October 1849. This is the only picture of the ship that there is, and it shows it in a storm, which is actually appropriate because as they entered the Gulf of Mexico, they were struck by a horrific storm and it almost took the ship under. On that ship was my great-grandmother, Agnes Gillespie, and her parents, Peter and Martha, and her brothers and sisters. Also on that ship was a young man by the name of Benjamin Thompson Stewart. He's not listed in the ship's manifest because he was part of the crew. It says he was a ship's captain, but he doesn't seem to be captaining the ship. So I don't know if it's like a pilot catching a trip on someone else's plane to a place where he picks up another plane and goes. I don't know what the situation is. Still trying to figure that out. But Agnes is walking on the deck one day, and Ben is walking on the deck one day, and their eyes meet. Some enchanted evening. They had an entire ocean journey to fall in love. And they did. And God bless the faithful women in our lives, because it appears that Agnes told Ben, that's great, you want to get married? But I'm not marrying someone who's not a member of the Church of Jesus Christ.